My garden had always been my pride, the one corner of my life that felt completely mine, and I never imagined it would turn into a battle that ended with someone else's career falling apart. My name is Janet, and I live in a subdivision outside Charlotte called Pinehurst Greens, the kind of place with matching mailboxes, strict lawn care schedules, and an HOA board that treated their little volunteer positions like seats on a corporate board. ID lived there for 9 years, raised 2 kids in that house, and never had a single complaint against my name until I decided to expand my backyard garden. I'd been growing tomatoes and peppers in a small bed for years without issue. But when my husband passed away 2 years ago, I started spending more time out there. It helped me grieve, gave my hands something to do, while my mind was busy missing him. By that spring, ID expanded into a proper kitchen garden, raised beds, a small greenhouse frame, a little gravel path between the rows. It gave me something to focus on, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like myself again. That's when Diane entered the picture. Diane had moved in the year before and gotten herself elected to the HOA board almost immediately, landing the role of Architectural Compliance Chair, a title she wore like a tiara. She walked the neighborhood most evenings with a clipboard and a little measuring wheel, the kind landscapers use, and within a month of my garden's expansion, I received a violation notice citing excessive non-ornamental landscaping and a $500 fine, with a 30-day deadline to remove the raised beds and greenhouse frame or face additional penalties accruing weekly. I'll admit, my first reaction was just tired. ID had enough upheaval in the past couple of years, and the thought of fighting with my neighbors over tomato plants felt almost comically small and exhausting at the same time. But I called the HOA office anyway, and eventually got Diane on the phone directly. She informed me, in that bright, false cheerful voice some people use right before they say something awful, that agricultural structures weren't permitted in visible yards, and that my greenhouse frame was, in her words, an eyesore that's bringing down property values for everyone on the cul-de-sac. I asked, politely, whether she'd actually seen my backyard, since my greenhouse frame faced the woods behind my property and wasn't visible from the street or any neighboring yard except possibly from a second-story window. She paused, just slightly, and said she'd received a complaint, and that was enough to warrant a citation under her discretion as compliance chair. Here's what Diane didn't know about me. For 11 years before retiring, I worked as a code enforcement officer for the city of Charlotte. I spent over a decade reading zoning ordinances, attending planning commission meetings, mediating disputes between neighbors, and explaining to homeowners exactly what they could and couldn't do with their property, and exactly what cities and HOAs could not do, no matter how badly they wanted to. I'd been yelled at by far scarier people than Diane. I'd also learned, the hard way, that the calmer you stay, the more unraveled the other person tends to get. I asked Diane to send me, in writing, the specific section of our CCVRS prohibiting raised garden beds and greenhouse frames, along with the name of the neighbor who'd filed the complaint, since our governing documents required complainant information be provided upon request for due process purposes. She said she'd have someone get back to me. Nobody did. Not that day, not the next, not by the end of the week. So that evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop, and I did what I used to do for a living. I pulled the actual recorded CCVR document from the County Register of Deeds website, the real one, 34 pages of dense legal language, not the glossy 4-page welcome packet they hand out to new homeowners with pictures of the pool. I went through every line, highlighting as I went, the way I used to when prepping for a hearing. There was nothing anywhere prohibiting vegetable gardens, raised beds, or small greenhouse structures. The only relevant clause restricted permanent structures over 6 feet in height in front yards, structures requiring a building permit under city code. My garden was entirely in the backyard, screened by a tree line, and my greenhouse frame was 4 feet tall, PVC pipe and plastic sheeting, the kind you can buy at any garden center and assemble in an afternoon. Not a permanent structure. Not in a front yard. Didn't meet a single criterion in that clause. Then I checked the city's zoning code for our district, the same code I'd enforced for over a decade, the same code I could probably recite sections of in my sleep. Backyard gardens, raised beds, and temporary greenhouse structures under a certain footprint were explicitly classified as permitted accessory uses in all residential zones. Full stop. No visibility restrictions. No size percentage limits. No discretionary clause allowing an HOA to override it based on context or complaints. I had cited this exact code section probably 100 times in my career, usually to homeowners who were thrilled to learn the city couldn't make them tear out their garden sheds. I also did something else, something that took a little more legwork. The next morning, I took my dog for an unusually long walk, with my phone in my pocket, and I photographed at least 6 other properties throughout Pinehurst Greens with greenhouse frames, garden sheds, raised beds, and one absolutely magnificent chicken coop, all clearly visible from the street, none of which had ever received a violation notice, as far as I knew. I cross-referenced the addresses with the HOA's violation log, which, as a homeowner, I was legally entitled to request under our state's HOA disclosure and transparency laws. I filed that request formally, in writing, through the management company, with a copy sent to the board's general email, creating an official. It took the management company 9 days to respond, which was itself a violation of the 14-day disclosure deadline, but when the log finally arrived, it was better than I'd hoped. Every single one of those 6 properties belonged to either a current board member, a board member's adult child living in the neighborhood, or, in one case, Diane's own sister-in-law, who'd moved in 2 streets over the previous fall. Not one of them had ever been cited for anything. I requested a hearing before the full HOA board, as our governing documents entitled me to before any fine could be finalized or escalated. I brought a folder, 3 copies, because old habits don't die. Inside was the recorded CCVER section showing no prohibition existed for what I had, the city zoning code explicitly permitting my exact garden setup as a protected accessory use, photographs of 6 other, violating properties owned by board members or their relatives that had never been cited, and the violation log itself, showing the pattern, along with a printed timeline of my records request and the 9-day delay in fulfilling it. The hearing took place in the clubhouse on a Thursday evening, 5 board members at a long folding table, Diane seated dead center, like she was chairing a tribunal. I laid out my folder and walked through it calmly, the way I used to in actual code enforcement hearings, where getting visibly upset only ever made you look like the unreasonable one, even when you weren't. I started with the CCVER language, reading the relevant section aloud, and pointing out there was simply no clause that applied to my garden. Then the zoning code, explaining that even if the HOA wanted to restrict gardens, they couldn't because the city's code explicitly protected this exact use, and an HOA's governing documents can't override municipal zoning law, only add reasonable aesthetic guidelines within what the law already permits. Then the photographs, laying them out one by one next to a printed photo of my own greenhouse frame, which, side by side, looked nearly identical to the one in Diane's own backyard, the one ID photographed from the public sidewalk behind her property, perfectly legal, public right-of-way. I finished by stating that I'd be happy to drop the matter entirely if the fine was rescinded in writing within 5 business days, and if the board wanted, I'd even be willing to help draft a clearer, legally sound garden policy going forward, one that wouldn't expose the HOA to the kind of liability that selective enforcement tends to create. But if the fine wasn't rescinded, I'd be filing a formal complaint with the state's HOA regulatory office for the disclosure violation and the documented selective enforcement, and a separate complaint with the city's zoning department regarding the HOA's attempt to fine a resident for use explicitly protected under municipal code. I mentioned gently that I knew exactly how those complaints needed to be written to actually get traction, since I'd reviewed hundreds of them from the other side of the desk for over a decade. I watched Diane's face go through about 4 different colors over the course of maybe 90 seconds. One of the other board members, a quiet, soft-spoken man named Carl, who I knew mostly from waving at across the cul-de-sac, asked to see the violation log photographs again. Then he asked Diane directly, in front of everyone, why her own greenhouse and her sister-in-law's chicken coop hadn't been cited under the same standard shed applied to mine. Diane said something about context and different circumstances and started to say something about the complaint shed received, but another board member, a woman named Pat who I'd never had much interaction with, asked the obvious follow-up. Who exactly had filed that complaint, and why hadn't Diane disclosed it when I'd requested that information in writing 9 days earlier, as required? Diane didn't have an answer. The silence at that table stretched long enough that I almost felt bad for her almost. The fine was rescinded that same week, in writing, with an actual apology this time, signed by the HOA's management company on behalf of the board. But that wasn't the end of it, not even close. It turned out Carl had been quietly documenting Diane's pattern for months, ever since she'd cited his elderly mother, who lived with him, for a wheelchair ramp that was, in fact, required by the Fair Housing Act's accessibility provisions and completely exempt from any HOA aesthetic restriction, a fact Diane apparently hadn't bothered to check before sending that citation either. Carl had quietly gathered his own folder, but had been hesitant to bring it forward alone, worried it would look like a personal vendetta. My hearing, with its documented records request, photographic evidence, and timeline, gave him the missing piece, proof that this wasn't an isolated incident involving just his family, but an established pattern. At the next annual meeting, about 6 weeks later, Carl brought a formal motion to the full membership, citing both his mother's situation and mine as documented examples of selective and retaliatory enforcement by the Architectural Compliance Chair, in violation of the HOA's own bylaws regarding fair and consistent application of community standards. The motion called for Diane's removal from the board entirely, not just her committee role. I went to that meeting too. I hadn't planned to speak, but when the floor opened for comments, I stood up anyway and gave a brief, calm summary of what had happened with my garden, how the citation had no basis in either the CCVERS or the zoning code, and how the violation log had revealed that board members and their families had never faced similar citations for nearly identical setups. I kept it short. I didn't need to say much. The folder had already done most of the work weeks earlier, and word travels fast in a neighborhood that size. The vote to remove Diane wasn't even close. I heard later, it was something like 41-6. Diane resigned from the board entirely before the vote results were even formally read aloud, which I'm told is a fairly common move, leaving before you're technically pushed. About 2 months after that, a for sale sign went up in her front yard. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband had decided Pinehurst Greens wasn't the right fit anymore, which, given everything, struck more than a few people as a remarkably understated way to put it. My garden is still there. Bigger now, actually. I added 2 more raised beds last spring, and the greenhouse frame is still standing, right where it's always been, screened by the same tree line, completely unbothered. Carl stopped by last summer to ask if I had extra tomato seedlings, and I sent him home with 4, plus a head start on some basil for his mother, who he said had taken quite a liking to fresh herbs since the ramp situation finally got sorted, permanently, and in writing. People like Diane count on the rest of us not knowing our rights, not reading the actual governing documents, and not knowing that local zoning law and federal housing protections can override an HOA's preferences entirely, regardless of how confidently someone with a clipboard and a measuring wheel might present otherwise. They count on intimidation working, on people being too tired or too busy to push back. But the records are public. The codes are public. And sometimes all it takes is someone who knows exactly where to look and the patience to actually look there.